with Bureau Chief of the Italian Daily, Federico Rampini. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Hi, Dana. Hi, everybody.
Thank you. And just to get started, could you kind of give me a little bit of background as your career as a journalist?
Yes, well, I started very young. This is my first and only job. I've never been anything else than a journalist and a writer, but being a writer is somehow similar. So I didn't even finish my graduation. I'm a dropout, a university dropout. I started in the year 1977 in Italy, working for the one of the magazines of the then Italian Communist Party. This was my first job as a reporter, and I covered the economy and labor unions. That was my first assignment. So after a few years, I just I was hired by non-political or apolitical magazines, newspapers. For a while, I was mainly specialized in covering economics. I started as a foreign correspondent very early. I was exactly 30 years old, when I was hired by, let's say, the Italian equivalent of the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times. So an economic and financial newspaper, Il Sole 24 Ore. I was hired by them as the Paris correspondent, foreign correspondent in France. After that, I very quickly switched to La Repubblica, and 10 years after so my Paris was in 86, long time ago. 10 years later, I was with La Repubblica, and I was a foreign correspondent for them in Brussels and Frankfurt, covering the European Monetary Union at the end of the 90s. Then they sent me to San Francisco, California, Silicon Valley, to cover and narrate the first internet revolution at the passage of the millennium. The behemoths of the digital economy were called Microsoft, of course, but also some dinosaurs like AOL. I still have an AOL email address. Or yeah, that's prehistory. After 4 years in San Francisco, I became the China bureau chief for La Repubblica, and then back to the United States in 2009 to cover two Obama administrations, and Trump, and now Biden.
That's very impressive that you say it is your first and only job. I think that's definitely a goal that a lot of people in the industry want to look back on in years to come and say that they achieved as well.
Let me say, I've tried to diversify because, as in every other part of the world, our industry is in trouble, especially the printed media. But I mean, it's really a very difficult transition to the digital era. So I am also a writer of books. Some of them have been bestsellers in Italy and Europe. I am a public speaker. I've also written and produced playwrights, theater. I'm a theater author back in Italy. But being a journalist is still my number one job and the main one.
Definitely. You said you started out kind of focusing on labor unions and economics. What kind of sparked your interest to pursue that as a young journalist?
Well, first of all, I grew up abroad, not in my country of origin. I was educated in Brussels, in Belgium, the capital of Europe, because my father worked as a civil servant at the European Commission. So Italy was obviously my country of origin, but also a foreign country to me. I decided to go to college, to attend college in Italy. I very quickly became a Communist Party member because, the Italian Communist Party in the second half of the 70s was basically a labor party, a socialist party.
Mhm.
We were severing our links to the Soviet Union. The Cold War was very much still ongoing, but we were trying to divorce from the Soviet Union Communist Party. We were a socialist party, and Italy was a very dynamic country in terms of labor relations. Labor
Mhm.
unions were strong in Italy at that time. There were a lot of social conflicts and strikes, labor turmoil in order to get better salaries, to catch up with other countries with better working conditions. And that was my first interest, and I was really very passionate about that, reducing social inequalities. Those are still very actual topics and very relevant issues,
Mhm.
but they were in my youth in Italy.
Okay, that's very interesting, and I'm glad that you were able to pursue a career kind of covering important events and policies around that. You said that you kind of quickly joined the Italian like Communist Party in your youth. Do you ever think that would have affected the way sources viewed you when you worked, and how did you kind of get around that if it was an obstacle?
So when I worked as a journalist for the Italian Communist Party, I was based in Italy. I was covering Italian news.
Mhm.
At that time, the Italian Communist Party was the second largest political party in Italy, sometimes even the first one, with a slight majority. Uh, so we were pretty much respected in Italy. The Italian sources took us very seriously because
Mhm.
at some point in 1970, 79, the Italian Communist Party was a member of the partner of a government coalition. So we were basically a leftist party, but at the same time a mainstream political party. So I didn't really have any problem with access to Italian sources. Later on, when I became a foreign correspondent and I worked in faraway countries, sometimes people would react strangely when I recounted my biography and my youth as a communist, especially here in the United States, where
Yeah.
communist still has a very heavy significance, and it's very heavily charged as a word. But I would say
Mhm.
that I never had really big issues as a journalist. My major problem in the United States occurred when I applied for a green card. And I had to be very transparent. I had to tell the whole truth about my past. So when I said that I had been a communist, then I had uh, to go to a very special interview with an officer of the immigration.
Wow, I didn't know that even today that would be something that people would want to know a lot about. But that's very
But in the end,
interesting.
by the way, in the end, I got my green card, and then I also became a citizen. There was another
Good.
interview, and once again, I had to explain why I had been a communist in my youth. But nowadays, I have dual citizenship. I'm an Italian citizen and also a U.S. citizen.
I'm very glad to hear that you are a US citizen. You've lived in many countries throughout your career. You also said that you were raised abroad from where you were born. How do you think that made you a better foreign correspondent when you traveled for your career?
Well, obviously, I was privileged. First of all, as a child, I learned a couple of foreign languages, first French and then English. that's already a plus when you are when you have to become later on a foreign correspondent. And also, I would say it's not just speaking foreign languages, but I was raised, my early education was in a European school in Brussels, where I was exposed to a very strange, very unusual kind of curriculum, because the books we had, the teachers we had were just not of one nationality. I didn't have only Italian teachers at the European school in Brussels. I had French, Dutch, German, at some point one English teacher, so a British teacher, I mean. So that means that also our, the programs, the curricula we had to study in geography, history, they were just not under a national perspective. They were already trying to teach us more global geography, more
Mhm.
global history. That was, I think, another privilege I had as a child. I didn't grow up in a narrow-minded kind of school institution.
Mhm. Okay, yeah, I definitely think that that can be helpful as well. Where do you think you had the most difficult time as a foreign correspondent, just based on like laws surrounding journalism in that country?
Well, in China, obviously in China. I was the China correspondent from 2004 till 2009.
Mhm.
At that time, the president of China was Hu Jintao. So that period of time in my assignment included the Olympic Games, Beijing Olympic Games in 2008. And I would say now I can say that China was more open than today's China under Xi Jinping,
Mhm.
in terms of censorship, in terms of freedom of movement inside the country. Certainly, my colleagues today, and I have many friends who work in China, uh, they have much more difficult assignment today, and yet, even in my period, 2004 2009, it was a very hard assignment, and I mean I had trouble with the Chinese police when I was covering riots in Tibet, when I was covering another turmoil, social protest riots in Xinjiang. It was not easy to have access, especially to those remote provinces where ethnic minorities are oppressed, are abused, and even then, foreign journalists were not particularly welcome, but at least we could travel. It was still possible, usually, to
Mhm.
travel inside China, even in those far away and problematic provinces, whereas today it's become harder and harder.
How do you think you were able to tackle the obstacles of traveling to places where a lot of turmoil was occurring and that they might not necessarily have been welcoming to foreign journalists like yourself?
Well, I must say, first of all, I was very grateful to my news assistant, a Chinese news assistant.
Mhm.
I'd rather not say her name, because nowadays those Chinese journalists who work for foreign media are under a tremendous pressure now, right now.
Mhm.
But she was very smart, very helpful, and very courageous, because sometimes she knew very well that we were going to have trouble with the authorities, but she felt that it was her duty to provide me with the utmost, the largest possible access to information, to sources, and even traveling in those faraway provinces. So she took more risk than me, and she was much more under pressure from local authorities than myself. So that was, I would say, my asset number one. Fantastic news assistant. What you
Mhm.
would say also in TV language, a producer. And then let's say that sometimes I was at liberty uh, to be just a tourist, to freely roam around the country, trying not to catch the attention of local authorities, but still keeping my eyes open, speaking
Mhm.
to people. And then I would wait for a while and later on write about what I had seen. But let's say also, I would like to add that because China between 2004 and 2009 was a different country from today's China, I myself had a favorable approach to the Chinese economic miracle. So most of my work as a journalist for La Republic, also as a writer of some of my most successful books, uh, I was covering China with a very positive bias. I think I was witnessing a fantastic story of economic development, and of course, a story of progress for more than 1 billion people. So I was not hostile, not at all. And this also
Mhm.
helped, I think, my Chinese sources saw me as someone who was sincerely, and I'm still now, sincerely interested in giving the whole story without bias, without prejudice.
Definitely. And your latest book kind of details the rivalry between the United States and China. I know a lot of that was heightened in the last 4 years, especially with the rise of the global pandemic across the not just the United States but Europe, like all over the world. How do you think the pandemic might have contributed to like the rapid rise in tension between the U.S. and China?
I think the pandemic has not really changed the dynamic. I think it has accelerated trends that were visible before the pandemic. I think that all the reasons for a harsher kind of rivalry between the US and China were obvious and very visible uh, at the end of 2019. The pandemic somehow increased the level of mistrust,
Mhm.
reciprocal mistrust. It increased also fears that globalization and being dependent on China has become a strategic liability, and it's become
Mhm.
dangerous for national security of the United States. So, but all these topics were already discussed before the pandemic. So I think that as a pandemic acts as a multiplier of issues that were already relevant before.
Okay. And do you think that the new administration might have a better chance on kind of rebuilding this trust that you say was kind of like an accelerated downward spiral between the US and China because of the pandemic?
So I think that this administration, the Biden administration, doesn't really want to build a better relation. I think that, in fact, although this is not quite, it's a story that most mainstream media in the United States are hiding. But there's a lot of continuity between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, at least on this field, US China relations. I think that the democratic establishment has underwent a total rethinking of their own approach to China. It was already starting at the end of the second Obama administration. The Democrats were
Mhm.
start, starting being more worried about the Chinese. But nowadays, I would say you will have a very, very tough approach towards China by the Biden administration, with probably the single exception of cooperation on climate change. All the other relevant topics, you will have a very, very tough approach, and it will be another kind of Cold War. Um, there,
Mhm.
there won't be the melodrama that we had under Donald Trump and all let's say the theater, but the
Mhm.
substance will be tough.
Do you think that kind of removing the theatrics of it all, as you described, will kind of help tensions die down, or do you think that it isn't that big of a contributing factor?
Well, maybe I should also correct myself. There's this aspect of the theatric that are completely
Mhm.
different under Biden, but there's at least one other huge difference. I
Mhm.
mentioned already the climate change cooperation, which is important, but also Biden thinks that in order to tackle the Chinese challenge, he needs allies, friends, and partners all over the world. So, whereas Trump went to the negotiations or the fight with the
Mhm.
Chinese alone, with a very unilateralist approach, Biden wants to gather the Europeans with him, or behind him, or beside him,
Mhm.
Japan, South Korea, possibly India, Australia. So there's a very, very strong investment on alliances. And this administration, the Biden administration, really believes that only if there is a very large coalition pressuring China, they can obtain some results.
Okay. And you talked about how you are working as a foreign journalist in the United States. How do you think your European audience perceived the Trump administration in the beginning of 2017 versus right now at the beginning of the Biden administration?
There's a lot of goodwill. Trump was never popular in Europe, with the exception of populist right wing parties in
Mhm.
Europe. But the majority of Europeans didn't like Donald Trump and didn't trust Donald Trump. So Biden has started his presidency with an enormous amount of goodwill among the European public opinions. And this means everywhere, from Britain to Italy, from France to Germany, and even the new Europe in the Eastern European countries. So they like him. And maybe they will even be disappointed at some point, because there's an enormous amount of expectations on Biden from the Europeans.
Mhm. And do you feel any kind of expectations to cover the administration any differently than you did with Trump as a foreign editor for a like European audience?
Oh yes, and I think the danger is to cater to our own audiences and to uh, to tell them the story they want to hear. That's the big danger. So as well as I never approved during the Trump presidency, although I work for a, let's say, a progressive newspaper, La Repubblica is
Mhm.
center left. I would say like the New York Times or the Washington Post in the US.
Mhm.
But I tried never to practice resistential journalism. You know what I mean? Because we had this experience in Italy when our prime minister was Silvio Berlusconi, which somehow was a pioneer in the Trump style politics. Uh,
Mhm.
did. Uh, we did follow the path of resistential journalism, and the
Mhm.
results were a disaster. You lose credibility when the newspaper becomes the actor of a crusade for, even if you think it's for the good cause. A crusade is not good journalism. So I tried not to be, a militant of the anti-Trump crusade during his 4 years presidency, and I'm trying not to be a militant of the pro-Biden crusade or pro-Black Lives Matter crusade now. I know my readers sometimes would love me to be, just an apologetic journalist during the Biden administration. I try to keep some distance, and so I'm still a believer on objectivity, and trying to be to be sometimes tough with your best friends.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm glad you brought up objectivity. I kind of wanted to talk about how, as a journalist, this has been your career for decades. How do you kind of go about checking your own like personal bias when working on like stories that you might have a lot of opinions about? Because I feel like with the digital age, a lot of times we only get how people feel about a story versus the actual objective story.
It's a constant struggle, and I reckon that I cannot say that I'm the winner in that struggle uh,
Mhm.
against my own biases. Sometimes, honesty is just letting your readers, your audience, know what your implicit biases are, what
Mhm.
your opinions, your beliefs are. Sometimes that's the most honest path. um, I don't think I don't subscribe to the self culpabilization where, because I am a white male, an old white male, I'm 65, old white male, everything I say about race, about gender, so 50% of the coverage of US
Mhm.
news nowadays, I'm not reliable because of the color of my skin, my age, and my gender. Frankly, I think that's a very dangerous trend nowadays. That uh, it reminds me of other periods in my life. I've seen so many cultural revolutions, political revolutions, social revolutions. From yes, the 70s, when the radical left was very strong among young people in Europe and all over the world. Uh,
Mhm.
I, I, I mean, I've covered so many of those movements, and then later on, I catched up with the Iranian Revolution, Islamic Revolution,
Mhm.
the Chinese Maoist cultural revolution, which I studied later on after it had ended. And I see some similarities to the most radical versions of the Black Lives Matter and at Me Too. So I try to keep my own balance and not to surrender to this kind of new censorship, woke culture, which, by the way, has also a very puritanical uh, origin. I mean, it reminds you of so many great awakenings, great religious awakenings in this puritanic country.
Yeah, definitely. And I see that you also have held the position of a visiting professor teaching journalism at various universities in the US and abroad. What kind of skill set do you think that you take as your career as a journalist and writer to the classroom?
So, in fact, my assignments as a teacher were short, sporadic. Only at the J School at UC Berkeley did I
Mhm.
journalism, because at Shanghai University, I just held some seminars on global economic issues, not on journalism. Journalism, you can't teach journalism in China, frankly. It's a not for a Western journalist.
Mhm.
There are so many differences that they wouldn't have hired me even for short seminars. So I think what I brought to my students, some of them, by the way, at Berkeley, were Chinese, and later on I found
Mhm.
in China in very interesting positions in Chinese media. I just tried to give them a global perspective. That was my uh, value added, what I could bring to them. My contribution was my experience as a European who had worked in the United States and then in Asia, and all my travels. So that was the scope of my work as a journalist, was what I could bring to them.
Definitely. No, that's really great to hear. And is there any advice that you would give to young people trying to pursue a career in foreign correspondence today?
Well, first of all, young people today have usually a very good training. Here in the United States, I think you have some of the best journalism schools in the world. I think of Berkeley and, of course, Columbia, but there are so many others. So
Mhm.
that's already a plus. Um, what I would add to those curricula, academic curricula, which are already remarkable and very high standing, is please don't forget to study history. I think that if you want to, for instance, in my job as a foreign correspondent, I literally carried with me libraries of printed books, paper books, and mostly history books. You can't be a good correspondent in China without studying at least a little bit of 3,000 years of history of China.
Yeah.
You can't write about the U.S. today if you haven't properly studied the Civil War, of course, slavery, but also Reconstruction after the Civil War. Or you can't cover, I think, appropriately what Joe Biden will do with his investment in infrastructure if you don't know well the history of the Great Depression, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and the New Deal, and so on and so forth. I mean, history is really for me uh, a guide, a guide.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. Those are all the questions that I have. If you have anything else you'd like to add, feel free.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you for your very interesting questions, and it was a pleasure and a privilege for me being interviewed by you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.